The King of England charges down on horseback to defend his title. Advance our standards, set upon our foes, our ancient world of courage, fair St. George, inspire us with the spleen of fiery dragons. Upon them, victory sits in our elms. But little did he know that England's longest dynasty was about to end. Welcome to Historical Effects. The Wars of the Roses was a battle for the English throne. Two sides of the House of Plantagenet, the Lancasters and the Yorks. The Lancasters were represented by a red rose, and the Yorks by a white rose, thus the Wars of the Roses. To look at the Wars of the Roses, it might be beneficial to begin with what created the split in the first place. Edward III is the King of England. He's primarily known for starting the 100 Years' War and dealing with the Black Death during his reign. His son and heir, Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. The Black Prince was a fierce leader in many of the battles during the 100 Years' War. However, while he was fighting in Spain, he fell ill. The Black Prince suffered from severe dysentery, and on June 8, 1376, he passed. Edward III died of a stroke just over a year later on June 21, 1377. Because Edward III outlived the Black Prince, the throne went to the son of the Black Prince, Richard of Bordeaux. He was now King Richard II of England, at 10 years old. The eldest of Edward III's surviving sons, John of Gaunt, was in charge of helping and guide his young nephew. As king, Richard supported many of the arts, including Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote Canterbury Tales during his reign. Politically, Richard II favored certain individuals, like Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. On the flip side, Richard II also beefed with many of the other barons. While the tensions were rising, John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, and Thomas Morbury were both exiled by Richard II for wanting to duel one another. While Henry Bolingbroke was in exile, his father passed, and Richard II prevented him from automatically inheriting his father's titles. Henry Bolingbroke gained support for his strength and ability to command. Henry led his supporters to overthrow Richard II and imprison the king. Richard died while in prison, as Henry became Henry IV of England. The Lancasters would have control of the throne through Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. The Yorks would be descendants of Edmund Langley, the Duke of York, and Lionel Antwerp, the Duke of Clarence, both sons of Edward III. During Henry VI's reign, his mental health greatly impacted his ability to rule, and to fill the role, Richard of York would step in as protector. Richard of York had actually attempted to persuade the king to name him as his heir the previous year, but was unsuccessful. Once Henry VI had recovered, he took back control of the throne. However, Richard of York still wanted the control of England, so Richard of York would go on to challenge the throne at the First Battle of St. Albans. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, worked with the Yorks to defeat the Lancasters. Despite waging war on the king, Richard of York did not want Henry VI to die. That's because Henry's recently born son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, would inherit the throne instead of Richard of York. Henry VI was captured and fell ill again, which made Richard of York the protector. Not long after, Henry VI was back on the throne. Henry VI did get some peace with Loveday when, in 1458, the Yorkists and Lancastrians held hands while walking to St. Paul's Cathedral. Unfortunately for Henry VI, the fighting would continue the following year. On July 10, 1460, the Lancasters lost at the Battle of Northampton, and Henry VI was captured again. Richard of York became protector for a third time. This time, however, Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, had fled to Scotland. Margaret got James III of Scotland's support and continued the fight. On December 30th, the Yorkists suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Wakefield, as their leader, Richard of York, was killed in battle. As the Yorks were fleeing, Richard of York's second eldest son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was killed by John Clifford. With the leader of the Yorks now dead, Richard's eldest son took charge and was successful at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, defeating and executing Owen Tudor. Remember him, he'll be important later. Richard Neville fought Margaret at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Margaret was victorious and took back the captured Henry VI. On March 29, 1461, the Yorks and Lancasters would violently clash at the Battle of Taunton, the bloodiest battle on English soil. Many Lancastrians died in an attempt to flee from the Yorkist forces as they ditched their heavy armor and struggled to cross a river. Following the battle, Edward was crowned Edward IV of England by Richard Neville, who would go on to be known as the Kingmaker. As king, Edward IV decided to marry Elizabeth Woodville, a non-royal widow. Surprisingly, someone not related to him. During this time, however, Richard Neville intended to ally with France. through a potential marriage to Edward IV. Richard Neville was surprised and was probably less than stoked about the king's unannounced wedding. Over the years, Lancastrian support grew, and in 1470, Richard Neville and the king's brother, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, went to France to ally with Margaret of Anjou to bring Henry VI back to power. Richard Neville, with French support, overthrew Edward IV, who went into exile with his youngest brother, Richard of Gloucester, in Burgundy. Henry VI was back on the throne, and his son, Edward of Westminster, married Richard Neville's daughter, Anne Neville. Edward IV's exile was not long, as he returned to reclaim the throne in 1471. At the foggy Battle of Barnet, the Yorkists bested the Lancasters, and Richard Neville was slain. On May 4th, the Battle of Tewkesbury erupted between Edward IV and Margaret of Anjou. Lord Hastings and Edward IV's brother, Richard of Gloucester, also helped lead the Yorkist troops. In the aftermath of the battle, Edward of Westminster, the heir to the throne, was finally killed. Edward IV took back the throne and imprisoned Henry VI and Margaret in the Tower of London. Henry VI would die soon after, likely being killed off as his son was no longer a threat. Margaret would later be ransomed and returned to France. In 1472, Richard of Gloucester married the newly widowed, fatherless, and father-in-law-less Anne Neville. George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, was imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1478 under the orders of his own brother. While in prison, he was executed, and rumors spread that he was drowned in a butt of wine. Throughout his reign, Edward IV was continuously challenged in his position, and in 1483, he fell ill. While the cause of his death is unknown, it may have been malaria or pneumonia, but some historians have even suggested he may have been poisoned. When Edward IV died, his eldest son was crowned Edward V of England at age 12. Similar to Richard II from earlier, Edward V had someone in charge of helping him rule. Richard of Gloucester became the protector of the young king. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, moved into the Tower of London. Acting as the protector, Richard of Gloucester announced that Edward IV had actually established intent to marry Lady Eleanor Butler before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, thus making Edward V and his siblings illegitimate. Richard of Gloucester declared himself the rightful ruler, and kept Edward V and his brother imprisoned. Mysteriously, the two boys were gone, with most believing that they were killed by their uncle, who is now King Richard III. Just to note, Richard III has long been seen as an evil usurper with exaggerated scoliosis. Both William Shakespeare and Thomas More wrote about Richard III after the events. They wrote it during the Tudor dynasty, which may have contributed to some anti-Yorkist bias in their writing. Although their depictions may not be entirely accurate, Richard III has long been seen as an overconfident, power-hungry, bunched-back tyrant. In his personal life, Richard would find tragedy. His son, Edward of Middleham, died of tuberculosis, leaving him with no heir, and in the following year, his wife became another victim to TB. Not only did Richard have to deal with many personal tragedies, but also many political problems. There was growing support for a newcomer, Henry Tudor. The step-nephew of Henry VI had looked to challenge him. Oh yeah, thanks for remembering Owen Tudor. He fits in right here as the stepfather to Henry VI. Henry Tudor probably wasn't a big fan that Edward IV and the Yorks executed his grandpa. With French and Scottish support, Henry Tudor landed in Wales, heading to take the throne. Richard III stayed in Leicester before setting up camp on Ambion Hill. On the 22nd of August, 1485, a battle erupted just outside New Eton, known as the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III and Henry Tudor went head-to-head for the English throne. Additionally, Lord Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derby, was there. He had long supported Richard III, but just became Henry Tudor's stepfather through his marriage to Lady Margaret Beaufort. So the question for him was if he should remain loyal to his king or to his new family. It also doesn't help that his son, George Stanley, was held captive by Richard III. Thomas Stanley decided to stay back from entering the battle. As the war raged on, Richard rode in on a horse. After Richard launched into the fight, Stanley's brother, William, had his troops go into attack, but to help Henry Tudor. Unfortunately for Richard, he either had to dismount his horse or his horse was killed, forcing Richard to fight on foot. At the end of the battle, Richard had been stabbed to death. Henry Tudor, claiming victory, had the crown retrieved to wear. Richard's body was stripped and carried off the battlefield to be displayed in Leicester. The remains of Richard III is an interesting story. The friars had Richard III buried in their church. However, his remains were lost to time when the church was destroyed. In 1612, Christopher Wren the Elder, the father of Sir Christopher Wren the architect, noted that Robert Herrick, an MP, had the stone memorial remains from the church in his garden. It wasn't until 2012 that the technology had improved and Richard III's bones were exhumed. His remains were finally found underneath a parking lot in Leicester. On October 30th, 1485, Henry was officially crowned King Henry VII, establishing the House of Tudor. The Plantagenet control of England, spanning Henry II in 1133 to Richard III in 1485, had finally concluded. To end the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII promised to unite the Yorks and the Lancasters by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, but who was also his fourth cousin. The end of the wars didn't stop some impostors from trying to claim the throne as their own. Lambert Simnel claimed that he was Edward, the Earl of Warwick, the son of George Plantagenet. However, the real Edward was still alive and held as a prisoner. Simnel's support was defeated, but he was eventually pardoned. In the 1490s, Perkin Warbeck claimed that he was Richard of Shrewsbury, Edward V's younger brother, that also had been in the Tower of London. Warbeck was also unsuccessful and was captured. He was released, but ultimately ended up back in prison. For Warbeck's second imprisonment, he teamed up with Edward, the Earl of Warwick, to try to escape. Unfortunately, they were both caught. Perkin Warbeck was hanged and Warwick was beheaded. Going back to the lives of the newly formed Tudors, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had 4 kids who lived past early childhood. Their first son, Arthur Tudor, was born in 1486 and became heir to the throne. Their other children, Henry, Margaret, and Mary, greatly influenced the line to the throne in the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1501, Prince Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. In 1503, Elizabeth of York also gave birth to another daughter, Catherine, who died within a week of birth. After the birth, Elizabeth developed an infection and also died. A few months after that, Prince Arthur died of a sweating sickness that spread throughout England. It's believed to have been hantavirus, a rodent-spread virus that caused the epidemic. When it came to his reign, Henry VII was challenged to recover the finances that were depleted during the Wars of the Roses. Fortunately, Henry successfully managed to improve the economy through trade. On April 21, 1509, Henry VII died of tuberculosis. He would have passed the throne to Arthur, but instead it went to his second, and more importantly still alive, son, who is now Henry VIII. Thank you so much for watching this first episode of Historical Effects. It's been in the process for about 4 years now. I started back in July of 2020, and it's been a fun but long process. If you want more, please subscribe and like, and tell me what you want to see next. Otherwise, see you next time.